has started. Gukesh has the white pieces and opens the game with 1d4. Gukesh has played e4 in this tournament as well, but he decides to play his queen's pawn against Magnus, and Magnus adjusting all his pieces before the game. This is not going to be an easy one. He got quite a scare against Vincent Keimer in the 4th round of this tournament, but smoothly sailed against Vasily Ivanchuk. Gukesh plays the London system. Wow, that is a bold choice because it leads to fresh positions and also exciting ones. Now you can see Magnus there. He has to decide what setup he wants to take against the London, and he chooses the relatively lesser played b6. The idea is to put your bishop on b7, but it's a hyper modern way to play because you're not playing in the center. Gukesh plays knight c3 with the idea to capture the center with pawn up to e4. And Magnus now has to decide what to do. He goes bishop b7, stopping the pawn from advancing. Gukesh is still in his preparation. He plays his pawn up to f3, and his point is he wants to play e4. Many times, if black goes d5 to stop it, you can still sacrifice a pawn. So Magnus doesn't even stop it. He says, Gukesh, okay, have your way, play e4. But what you've done with f3 is that your knight can no longer develop on that square. So Gukesh does go e4. Now, if you play d5, there are ideas of knight b5 attacking c7. And that's the reason why Magnus says, first I'll control the b5 square and only then strike in the center. So Gukesh, now you can see him thinking about his next move with his eyes closed. He's trying to figure out what to do. He still seems to be in his prep as he has 1 hour 32 minutes on the clock. Queen d2 with the idea of long castle. So Gukesh playing very aggressively. And now it's time for Magnus to strike in the center. He does so with the pawn up to d5. Gukesh has an important choice here. Should he push the pawn? But pushing the pawn right now would not be a good idea because knight goes back and then black hits with c5. So that's the reason why long castle has been played. And the point is very clear. If you take here, then I take back with my knight. You take with your knight, I take back with the pawn. You take the bishop, I play queen up, you go back, and then I push my pawn, and suddenly your king in the center is in big trouble because there is a lot of attack. Bishop takes is met with c4. So as Magnus, you don't want to be opening up the position. You want to keep it closed, and that's the reason why he goes bishop b4. Now, you can see that there are two main moves here. One is e5, knight d7, and because the bishop has developed here, there's bishop g5. And you have to assess this position. How do you like it for white? Or if you don't like pushing the pawn to e5, there's another move which is to play pawn up to a3 and forcing bishop takes, queen takes. Gukesh goes for the move a3. This is more aggressive, you can say, and even more fluid, while pushing the pawn led to more static positions. Now Magnus must take the knight. He takes it with his bishop. Queen takes on c3. With the bishop and the queen combined, there's attack on the c7 pawn. Magnus takes the pawn on e4. Gukesh cannot take back because knight would take here. So the move here is bishop c7. And the variation could go queen c8, bishop takes, queen takes, pawn takes, knight d5 attacking the bishop. And then this could lead to kind of an equalish position here. So Gukesh is calculating whether he should take this bishop takes pawn, or there is also another interesting move here, which is to push the pawn in the center, making use of his lead in development. He has a rook here, a queen here. And between these two moves lies what Gukesh needs to do next. His bishop takes c7, Magnus can go queen c8 or even queen d5. He goes d5. What a move here. And let's try to analyze the different possibilities. If you take now with the pawn, then after bishop c7, queen c8, already I have an improvement, which is queen e5 check. You don't want to do that. That's not good for you. So you don't take with the pawn, but maybe you want to take here with the bishop. But if you take with the bishop, After takes, queen c8, I take, and my queen enters here, and it's already big trouble. So you can't even take with the bishop. And that's the reason why the most logical move for Magnus now is to take with the knight. And he does so. He plays it. But Gukesh's idea now, of course the queen is attacked, so you need to do something about it. But his idea is to pluck this pawn on g7. He takes it. And if the rook had to move, black is already lost. Like rook f8 or something, you are just busted. You know, bishop g5 is coming and too many problems. But queen f6 is what Magnus had on his mind. And now the queen trade is imperative, because if you move your queen, the bishop is hanging. So you have to take, queen takes, knight takes. And let's take stock of the position. White has the bishop pair here, and black has currently an extra pawn. So Gukesh goes bishop e5 first, forcing the king to come up. And now, next, he can take the pawn on c7 and at least equalize the material. Bishop takes on c7 has occurred. Although the material is equal and the queens are off the board, the position is by no means drawish. That's because black's king is in the center, Gukesh has the bishop pair, black has a very nice pawn structure. There are too many imbalances here. Now first Magnus develops, defends his pawn, and Gukesh goes bishop g3. His idea at some point is to pop out his bishop on this square and pin the knight. So that is a very interesting plan. And Magnus goes rook h to g8. Gukesh could have put his bishop now on h4. It's a good move, and Magnus has to maybe move away, king e8. Then take, knight f3. The position should be roundabout equal. But with 55 minutes on the clock, Gukesh's move here is a critical one. He makes a very weird move, bishop e2. And this is a little bit difficult to understand, but the point it seems is to take here, bishop takes, and put his pawn on bishop on f3. But what a classy move by Magnus. You see, Magnus understood that now taking with the bishop here doesn't make sense because he's going to go bishop f3, so he wants to take with the knight. But once he takes after fe4, knight takes, there's always a check. So with king e8, he avoids the check. And while this move may not seem spectacular or even like there's no combination or something, it really puts a lot of pressure on Gukesh. Pawn takes. And now Magnus need not take with the bishop because Gukesh is ready with his move bishop f3 here, but knight e4. And now there's no check. So the bishop is hanging. You can't even move the bishop anywhere. Let's say you go bishop f4, because then there's knight f2 and also the g2 pawn is hanging. So he goes bishop f3, hitting the knight and also pinning it here. Now Gukesh would have calculated knight takes g3, and then there is bishop takes b7 as well. However, black has a very strong move here, rook a7, and that leads to fine position. So after knight takes g3 now, Gukesh most likely will recapture h takes g3. Bishop b7, rook a7, h g3, rook takes is also a possibility. This also leads to a fine position, but I feel that here black is doing fine, like as in the game, he's doing quite well. So Gukesh now trying to figure out how to proceed, and he takes h takes g3. Now while Gukesh's pawns are weak here, Magnus also has a weak pawn on h7. So he takes on f3, and you must take back with the knight, developing a piece. So knight takes f3, and I think Magnus is very likely going to chop off the pawn here on g3. This is very likely to happen. So he takes rook takes g3, and now Gukesh also must take this pawn on h7. He takes it. Can black win a pawn here? Because if you give a check, there is a knight f8 which blocks. But there is this very nice move, knight e5, hitting here, and if you take the knight, then rook h8, and I win the knight, win the rook in the corner. So Magnus, firstly, I don't think is keen on taking the g2 pawn. He goes king e7 and tells Gukesh that look, your problem is now that this pawn is weak while I have two connected central pawns. So very minuscule edge for black, but this is all that Magnus needs often. Knight d4, fantastic move by Gukesh, looking at the c6 square and trying to create some kind of an attack with his two rooks and a knight. How should Magnus continue here? You can see he has more time on the clock than Gukesh, and he finds this very nice move, knight e5, because now the c6 square is controlled by the knight, and the knight is slightly shaky on e5, but it's not so easy to attack it. Gukesh goes rook e1. Now the king can come to d6 or f6. These are both the moves which can sort of save the knight. Or Magnus can decide to go rook g4 and attack Gukesh's knight on d4. These are the two possibilities. What does Magnus choose here is the question. He wants to keep that small fire of initiative going on here, because if 2-3 inaccurate moves by black, or even maybe one, this is very close to a draw. So he goes rook g4, and here Gukesh had an interesting option with knight f5, because if Magnus takes here, this is completely good for Gukesh. But Magnus would have most likely gone king f6 and then knight d6. Seems like equal, but Gukesh goes and takes the knight. Magnus also chops off the knight. And now Gukesh makes this slightly passive move, rook e2. Maybe better was rook e3 with the idea of rook f3. But he goes rook e2, and this is what Magnus needs. First, he goes rook d8, threatening mate in one here. Of course, Gukesh is going to deal with it, and the best way to deal seems c3. So he makes a little luft for his king. And now this next move is very, very instructive that Magnus plays, because currently White's entire counterplay is related with this pawn on f7. And if Gukesh can get rook f2, he would be very happy. So a prophylactic move, rook f4. So nicely played. And now Gukesh does not have this move. So he brings up his king to c2. But there is a weakness now, g2 pawn. And you can actually mount on it by putting your two rooks. So he puts his first rook on g8. For the time being, Gukesh has his pawn controlled, but Magnus can slowly start improving the position. So Gukesh needs his own counterplay, and the best way to do it is to push his queenside pawns. He first goes b4. This is an excellent move. If he gets a4, king b3, later on try to create a passer there because he has a majority. Magnus says, I'm stopping your pawns in their tracks right now. I go b5, and Gukesh, what are you planning to do? Well, Gukesh can continue with his king march in the upward direction. He goes king b3. So Gukesh is making progress, but now Magnus hits the pawn. Of course, you're not going to come back and defend it. That's too passive. The more active solution is to play rook f2 and attack the f7 pawn. But what Magnus has realized is that after rook f2, and when he puts one of his rooks on g7, and one pair of rooks are traded, then his central pawns can roll much more easily, because then White has only one rook and not two. So rook g7 played, and now Gukesh has a choice between taking this rook or coming back passively. He takes it, rook takes. And if black is given time, he would go f5, king f6, e5, e4, king e5, f4. Just roll the central pawns. So Gukesh says, I need to create a passer here, a4. Fantastic move. This is exactly what is needed to create a passer. And until now, both players have played excellently. Gukesh has held his own against the world number one. Magnus goes f5. You need to take on b5. And Gukesh takes, pawn takes. And now comes the critical moment of the game. The right move is c4. How does this work? Because he comes in with a check, you bring your rook up, the pawn ending is a drawn position. This is a draw. So black will most likely take this. Then you double your pawns. He goes back, you push the pawn, rook comes here, you push another pawn, and it seems like this position should be lost for White because he has one pawn, but black has two. Now the trick here is to maintain your white king in a way that it helps this pawn but also does not go all the way. It rather stays in the vicinity of the black pawns as well, like here king c4. And now you cannot really make progress because the king comes back and this pawn is going to keep the rook tied up. In this way, Gukesh could have actually made a draw. He should push his pawn up. This is his only counterplay right now in the position. If he does not push it up, then Magnus is clearly better. So Gukesh has 13 minutes to sort of work this entire thing out, but it's definitely clear that this move is not at all easy because you are going to give up a pawn there. He goes rook a2 and this is not a good move. Now Magnus can actually win the game with a very nice move. King d6, rook a5, king c6, check, king d5, rook b6, and then this is a winning endgame for him. But he goes rook g5 and Magnus was very proud of this move after the game. But Gukesh has a drawing line here. Rook a5, f4 and then king c2 coming in with the king to the center, and this was a draw, but Gukesh gives a check. This is the final mistake of the game and now Magnus is in the driver's seat. There's no stopping his pawns because he's going to take on g2 and he's going to roll his central pawns down the board. So this is game over. Rook goes back to a2, but this is not going to help Gukesh at all. This is passive. When you have to come back and defend, you know it, that there is nothing left. Rook comes to c2 and Magnus is completely in control now. He plays rook g3, even stopping all counterplay. Gukesh goes king e2 with some ideas of take, b5 counterplay, but Magnus even squashes that with his next move. Beautiful move, king e5, because now if c4 takes, b5, king comes, defends it, rook will come to b3. So he goes king b2, trying to keep it cool. Now the king comes to d5 and the central pawn now plans to roll down. So Magnus is totally winning here. Check. And king comes in with king to e4. Yeah, king e4 played. And Gukesh now has a very, very difficult task to even find a good move. He plays king b3, but the black pawns are rolling down now. First time for the e-pawn to step one step ahead. Yes, e5. And Magnus would even like to move his king away. Maybe king comes up. He gives a check. And the king moves back to f5. So e4, e3 is incoming. Then you go king e4, slowly push the pawn, create a passer, rook d2. And this is where Magnus's calculation, final calculation, e4, he's ready to give up this b5 pawn because he realizes that these two pawns are going to do the job for him. Look at Gukesh there. He's quite upset with himself. He knew that he has a draw somewhere, but Magnus viewed his endgame magic so beautifully and so brutally that Gukesh, with all his talent and all his skills, could do nothing to stop it. That's what happens when you play this Mozart of chess. He often creates chances which his opponents, no matter how skilled, are not able to see. And after rook takes b5, now the e-pawn is rushing down the board. e3, fantastic move. Later on the rook can take this and then you have two passers. Meanwhile white does have two passers, but they are way away from the queening squares, so it's not going to work. Gukesh gives a check with his rook, and now king f5, king comes up. Gukesh doesn't even have the time to push any of his pawns because e2 is straight away queen, so he gives a check. And Magnus goes king e4. Gukesh's idea is rook b8, so that if e2 he can give a check from behind, but anyway Magnus can come down with his king. He plays e2 and this is over. Rook e8 check, king d3, and there's nothing that can be done. Gukesh resigns and then